Hello, everybody. I hope you're having a great fall festival so far. My name is Chris, I'm with Rose City Originals, and today I'm going to show you how to make my new quilted trucker hat. So to get started, a few things you'll need to gather up. For the front panel, it is a 10-inch by 10-inch square. You can use a layer cake square, you can use an orphan block, or you can make something special just for your hat. Today I'll be using this piece, which I made from some offcuts from a quilt I recently made. So you'll need your panel, and you'll also need some batting and a backing and get it quilted. We'll be going over that in just a second. For the rest of the outer shell of the hat, you will need a 1/4 yard of fabric or a fat quarter. I'll be using this coordinated ultramarine from Kona. For the lining, you will also need a 1/4 yard of fabric or a fat quarter. I have this fun print that I'll be incorporating. You're also going to need some fusible lightweight interfacing and some fusible extra firm stabilizer. For today, I'm going to be using my Qnique 16X Elite and the Quilter's Creative Touch automation software to quilt out the front panel for my hat. So here I have some just scrap fabric for the backing and then 2 layers of batting all set up ready to go. So now that I have my batting on here, I can baste down my fabric. All right, everything's basted down. Let's get our pattern placed. I'm actually going to use the same pantograph as I used on the quilt that these scraps are from. I do want the pattern fairly dense because it is a small area and I want more than just one flower on it. So I have my height set to just under 2 inches for the motif. These are 1-inch half square triangles. So that will be about 2 rows worth for the height of the flower. Now that our front panel is all quilted, we can go ahead and cut out the front of the hat. Now, I prefer to trace my pattern pieces onto the fabric rather than using it as a template. That way I don't accidentally cut my pattern piece. Since this is a little bit busier on the front, I am actually going to trace on the back side of the fabric. That way it's a little easier to see. So also something to consider when picking your back fabric, probably choose something lighter that you can easily trace on. I do want the print part of the half square triangle pointing down towards the hat brim. So this is the top, this is the bottom. I don't have anything to be fussy about, so I am just going to go ahead and trace this in about the center. I am using a friction fine liner pen. But really, you could use anything that won't bleed through your fabric, since this is on the back side and won't be visible. Now, we do also want to transfer these markings and mark the center of the front. We'll just lift the pattern piece back and transfer those. And now we're ready to cut out. You could cut this out with scissors. I like to use a small 28mm rotary cutter. This is my True Cut 28mm. I find that the 28mm is a little bit easier to cut curves with because it's a smaller blade. And then just follow the lines. All of the pattern pieces include a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So remember that when cutting, you want to be somewhat accurate, but it's not the end of the world if you are slightly off from the line. It is a fairly forgiving pattern. And the front of the hat is ready. Now onto the fabric that will be the rest of the outside shell of your hat. You'll take your 1/4 yard of fusible interfacing, which should be about 9 inches by 20 inches, and fuse it onto half of your fabric. You can see here I am using yardage. So it is just on this half of the fabric. This half is left uninterfaced. If this was a fat 1/4, the uninterfaced side would simply be right here. It's the same amount of fabric. Now on the interfaced section, what we need is 2 hat sides, 2 hat backs, and 2 straps. The hat straps are a rectangle that measures 1 1/4 by 7.5 inches. So if it's easier, you can just cut out with your rotary cutter. And then on the front side of the hat straps, you will want to mark your placement for your snaps. Because this is a heat erasable pen and I will be ironing these later, I'm going to hold off on that for now. So these I can set aside. Now we can trace out our other pieces. These pieces are directional, so we will need one side with the text facing up and one with the text facing down. The pattern does include a cutting diagram to help you lay out your pieces so that you can make sure they will all fit onto your material. I had several people testing this pattern for me, and many of them used some upcycled material, such as old corduroy or denim, for their hats, and they turned out looking amazing. So you don't have to use quilting cotton. All right, we have a single dot here. We need to transfer that over. And there are markings here, but those are specifically for the lining, so we don't need to transfer them onto this fabric. So there is one. We'll flip this to make another one. Now this pattern is available both in print and digital form. If you are printing your pattern at home, you will want to make sure that you print it at 100%, no scaling, and use the 1-inch test square to make sure that it printed out correctly. Transfer our dots. And those are our 2 hat back pieces from the outer shell fabric. This pattern piece, we have both a single dot and double dots. So make sure those are all marked, as well as this indicator here for where the brim of the hat ends. So we have our dots and our line. So now we'll flip this piece over, trace it again. Let's go ahead and cut these out. This video is sped up just for the sake of time. But take it slow, take your time, and be safe when using a rotary cutter. Now with the remaining outer shell fabric, we need to cut out the top and bottom of our brim. Since there is plenty of material left, we can just put this on a fold and trace. Cutting with our rotary cutter, we don't have to worry about the fabric shifting. If you are cutting with scissors, you'll want to pin or trace individually. All right, all of our outer shell pieces are cut. So now we can move on to the lining. This piece you can see has already been used for another project, but that is fine. I am actually going to, though, flip this. So I'm working from the back side because it's a little bit lighter, easier to see. So from the lining, we will need to cut 1 front panel and then 2 of each of the hat side and hat back. Now you could just trace this out, but what I like to do, I'll just kind of gauge how much I need, is fold your fabric and then you can trace your hat front right on the fold. So take your pattern piece and fold it in half. And that will get traced right there. And then our hat front and our hat back. Now you can see there's plenty of fabric left over. So if you have a directional print, you have plenty of space to have these all facing the same direction if you need to. And we need to transfer those dots. It is not necessary to transfer the brim end marking onto your lining fabric. Now, since this is the lining, we need to copy over this lining opening marking. All right, let's cut those out. Before we forget, let's transfer those markings onto the other side. And there's our hat sides, and now we just have the hat front left to go. Now the last thing that we need to cut out is the ultra firm stabilizer for your hat brim. This is what's going to give it structure, shape, and stability. So I've just cut a piece off. Now this is fusible, so one side is just the material and the other side has little glue dots on it. It doesn't matter which side at this point you're tracing onto, but I have found it's easier to trace onto the non-glue dot side. So we'll trace this out. And now for the stabilizer, I do like to cut this with scissors. Now we are not going to fuse this at this point. So just set that aside along with the brim. Now we're ready to start sewing. And now that everything's cut out, we can create the brim of the hat. So we're going to start by sewing a 1/4 inch seam around the outside edge of the brim. And now we'll take this over to the iron so that we can secure the brim lining. So now we need to fuse this in place. And you want to make sure that the stabilizer is just inside of that stitching line. If you need to make some adjustments and trim the stabilizer, that's fine. Now the instructions for the stabilizer said you shouldn't iron directly onto the stabilizer. So I'm just going to use a scrap of fabric to cover that after I've lined it all up. It does recommend using a damp pressing cloth. I'm just going to use this cloth with a little bit of steam. So we can see that's connected. I'm also going to iron from the other side just to make sure all of that glue is activated. And now we'll need to turn this right side out. You do want to make sure it cools fully because if that glue is still warm, it can peel off. Now that it's cool, and flip it right side out. And that stabilizer helps get really smooth edges. Then I'm going to give it a press from the side of the brim that does not have the stabilizer on it. And now we can take it back over to the sewing machine to do some top stitching. I am going to change out the thread in my machine for this variegated thread that I used to quilt it so that all of my top stitching matches. And this is King of Atlantis by Finesse Threads. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple and only make 3 lines of stitching to hold everything in place. So the first line I'm going to do 1/2 inch from the edge, and then a 1/4 inch in from that, and another 1/4 inch in from that. But you can do as many lines of stitching as you like. There we go. Before we move on to the next step, I also need to do a basting stitch around this raw edge just to keep all of the layers in place when we go to attach our brim. So you'll want to do that about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. And now that the brim is created, we can work on the outer shell of the hat. So we'll start with our front panel, and we need to sew this dart. So you can just fold this in half. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch to create that dart. You can clip it in place or pin it if you need. Then we can just finger press the seam open. It's pretty stiff. We just really need it open at the end here. And now we need to attach one of the side panels to the right side. Now when you cut everything out, you marked with those 2 dots. That's to help us make sure that we have the correct side panel. So this is the side panel I need, because when they are right sides together, those two dots should match. So we're just going to sew this onto the side. All right, so that's attached. We'll take this over to the iron. We want to press this seam. So we need to press this so that it's a nice crisp seam with the seam allowance bulk facing the side. Now, since this isn't flat, you can't just lay it on your ironing board. So a tailor's ham comes in really handy for this. If you don't have a tailor's ham, you can just use an old rolled up towel to help with those curves. There you go. Now for the back of the hat, we have our two back pieces, and we're going to put them right sides together and sew 1/4 inch down the center back seam. Now we need to go press this seam open. I'll go through and finger press it open just to get me started. And then again, using that rolled up towel, and give it a good press with my iron. And now that the seam is pressed open, we need to top stitch about 1/8 of an inch on either side of that seam. And what that will do is secure this on the back side. So my foot, this side is 1/4 inch and this side is 1/8 of an inch. So I will just use that as my guide. Beautiful. And now, just like with the hat front, we need to attach a side piece onto the right-hand side here. To connect the back, there's a single dot on the side piece and a single dot on the back piece. So you can align those and ensure you are attaching it to the correct side. And for this seam, we're going to press it towards the back of the hat. So let me go press that, I'll be right back. So now that that's pressed, we need to join both halves together. To get a nice point on the top of your hat, what I like to do is I'll take a straight pin and poke it through on the half that has the back so that it comes out right at the peak of the point, right there. And then take that pin and poke it right into the peak of the point on the front of the hat. And now those are lined up. Now some of this is pretty bulky and it can be somewhat hard to pin through. So using some clips is really going to be beneficial. So while the pin is still in there and it's just holding it in alignment, I'll put a clip on either side. And then I can remove that pin. And this is what will hold it in place while I'm sewing. If you like, you can go ahead and clip every couple inches down the side. And then we're going to sew all the way to connect the two halves. It gets really bulky at the center, so just go slow so you don't break a needle. The outer shell is now assembled, but we need to do some top stitching. I do find it easiest to keep it wrong side out, so it's kind of like a big bowl, because my machine does not have a free arm. So now what we are going to do is do another top stitch about 1/8 of an inch from this seam and from this seam. So this is the front of the hat, this is the back of the hat, and all of the seams should be facing towards the back of the hat. As we stitch along, we're going to continue in a straight line when we cross over the center point. So it'll make an X across the top of the hat. There's a good view. So you'll sew this and then sew this. I'll try to keep my hands out of the camera. Again, as you're going over the center, there is a lot of bulk. So just take your time and go slow. There's one. The outer shell of the hat is now complete, and we can move on to the lining. So the lining is made pretty much the same way with a few variations. So we'll start with the front panel. And then on the right-hand side, we are again going to add a side panel, making sure to match up the double dots. And now for this seam, instead of pressing it towards the side piece, we want to press it towards the front panel. Now we're going to take our two back pieces, but this time we're going to leave an opening between those two marks indicated on the pattern. And be sure to backstitch. It will help when we're turning our hat right side out. Now for the lining, we don't need to do any top stitching. So we will just take our remaining side piece and attach the side panel to the right side again. And for this, instead of pressing towards the back, we are pressing towards the side. Now, just like before, we're going to join our two halves and we want to match up the point of that triangle right there. So we'll do our same trick with the pin to get those aligned and follow up with the clip on each side and then just stitch that. All right, and then we're going to press so that all of our seams in the lining are facing towards the front of the hat. Okay, the shell is all sewn and pressed. Now let's make our straps. So we have our two strap pieces. We're going to fold them in half lengthwise and stitch 1/4 inch of each side. I am just going to clip the corners here, and that's just going to make it a little bit easier to turn right side out. A little less bulk there, and this is along the fold side. And then we need to turn these right side out. Can be a little tricky to get started. Be sure to poke the corners out. And we'll do that with the other one. And then I'll take these over to the iron and give them a good press. Now that we have all of our components created, we can start assembling. We will start with the outer shell and the brim. To attach the brim, you're going to want to find the center point of both the hat front and the brim. There are markings on the pattern pieces, but if you did not transfer them or they have been ironed away, you can simply fold it in half to find that center point and use a straight pin to mark it. And the center of the brim. Don't worry too much about creasing the brim because we will end up steaming it later to flatten it out. Attaching the brim is probably the hardest part of the whole process. So just take your time and use lots of pins or clips. Now we're going to want to attach the brim with the top side facing the front of the hat. The top side, as you recall, is the side that had the ultra firm stabilizer fused to it. So if you can't tell which is which, you can just see if the fabric has any give to it. You can tell which side has been fused to that ultra firm stabilizer. So this is the top of my brim. This is the underside. I want this touching the front of the hat. We will line up those two pins. The ultra firm stabilizer can be hard to pin through, so I will be using clips. While I have the middle lined up, I will throw on a clip, and then it is easiest to work from the hat side to move it little by little so that the raw edges are lined up with the brim. And like I said, use lots and lots of clips or pins. One of the markings from your pattern piece is this brim end here. And the end of the brim, not including the dog ears, should align with that. If it's not exact and it's off by maybe a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, it is not a big deal. But you will want to make sure that it is even on both sides. And now we'll go down the other side. And now that it is clipped all the way, we need to sew it in place. And you'll just be sewing this with your 1/4 inch seam allowance. I do recommend sewing with the brim on the underside. For me, that just helps keep everything flat. So now that we have the brim basted in place, with the outer shell still right side out, we're going to take our lining wrong side out and clip it in place. You're going to line up each of the seams. So I will start by clipping at each of the seams, just getting all of those aligned, and then throw in a few extra clips around the front just to make sure everything stays in place. That brim can make it a little fiddly. There we go. So the brim should be tucked between the outer shell and the lining, and we are going to sew just along the bottom edge at 3/8 of an inch. Now we want to insert our hat straps. So that will go in along the back arch of the hat in this opening. And what you'll do is you'll take your strap, folded side in, and just scoot it in along that stitching line. And you will want it to stick out about 1/4 of an inch. So we'll just put a clip in to hold that in place. I'll add a clip for the center seam here to keep that in place. And then the second hat strap, again, folded side in, and have it stick out about 1/4 of an inch. And then sew along that arch. I like to do some back stitches at both edges of the strap, just so that it's nice and secure. All right, now we're going to turn it right side out through that gap that we left in the lining. I find the easiest way is to reach in there and just find one edge of the brim. Start from that side, and then work to get the brim out first. The brim is going to get bent. It is okay. All right. And then a fun thing is you can find those straps and just pull on them, and they will turn that corner out nicely for you, so you don't have to reach in and poke it out. Now we need to close up that opening. We're just going to top stitch really close to the edge to seal that up. If you want, you can sew this up by hand, but this is a little faster. All right, that is all sealed up, so we're going to head back over to the iron, and we're going to give this a really good press along this bottom edge before we top stitch it, as well as around the back arch, and we will give some steam to the brim to get it flat again. So we're going to use that rolled up towel again, or if you have a tailor's ham, you can use that. And we just want to press this bottom edge so that all of the lining is on the inside and we have a nice crisp seam. Some of the flatter parts you can do without it, if it's easier for you. Now for a wrinkly brim, the easiest thing to do is just use a lot of steam and press it flat. While the stabilizer is warm, it's very flexible, but once it cools down, it'll stiffen up. Now we'll go back over to the machine, and we are going to top stitch about 1/4 of an inch along the bottom edge and 1/8 of an inch along the back arch. Now, depending on your machine, it might be easier to stitch from the top side and go around, like if you have a free arm, which I don't, or stitch from the lining side and go around, which is what I will do today. So along the bottom edge, my top stitch will be about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. It doesn't have to be exact, just be consistent all the way around. As you're going, you can make sure that everything stays where it needs to be. And if the lining is too loose for you, you can also pin that in place to keep it out of the way. It is going to be really thick along the front of the hat, so just take your time. And there you have it. Now, one thing to note, in the beginning, I did show that I used 2 layers of batting when I quilted the front panel. One of those layers was an 80-20 blend. And because of those natural fibers and the dense quilting, along with some very small piecing, it did make it a little more difficult to construct the hat. So that is something to consider when you're choosing your materials. If you have some small piecing or some dense quilting, be sure to go with probably a synthetic batting. It'll be a little easier to get the needle through. You can also use something like a fusible foam stabilizer that gives a lot of structure without making it too dense to sew through. Now, I wasn't able to go over every step in detail with the time that I had today, so if you head over to my website, rosecityoriginals.com, you could pick up a copy of my pattern and use the code FESTIVAL23 for 20% off either the digital or the printed version. That code is good through the end of October. So if you enjoyed my segment today and you like all things quilty, be sure to join me on social media. I can be found on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Threads, all at Rose City Originals. Hope to see you there.